Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second week of EDLD 760, focusing on the pilot study. We're just going to briefly talk about a couple of things that we talked about the first week, finalizing the research question. So I'll talk through a little bit of things you might want to think about around the research question. We will talk about the pilot study map, which will be due the third week, and also kind of pointing the way to the data collection protocol videos. Okay, so by now you should have brainstormed a few versions of a research question. If you haven't yet, I'd like you to pause the video and take the time to think about your overarching research question. So remember, this is not interview questions, this is an overarching research question. And right now we're focused on our pilot study, even though that research question is also likely to be useful for your dissertation. So you should take the time to brainstorm a few different ways of formatting that research question based on the kinds of things we discussed the first week. So the question, how you start the question, making sure there's a specific context, etc. All right. And I'm going to go through some things you might want to think about as you revise those different versions. All right. So for one, you might want to think about feasibility and specificity. All right. In terms of feasibility, if you check out this question right here, how can Hispanic serving institutions increase retention among Latino students through integrating academic and student programs? There's some issues with feasibility here, so think about it for a moment. What might be difficult to do, especially during a pilot study, but even during a dissertation here? You might notice that even though it's really nicely specific, it asks, how can a Hispanic serving institution increase retention? It's very difficult to measure that over the course of a pilot study, right? I mean, we might want to increase retention, that might be the ultimate goal, but we won't be able to measure that in the semester. And we also, frankly, probably wouldn't be able to measure that over the course of a dissertation, a full dissertation. Also here, through integrating academic and student programs, that's a big thing to ask for, right? I mean, not only does it lack specificity, which academic and student programs, it also is very difficult to do institutionally. So that research question is not very feasible. An example of a research question that's too general is this one here. What is the relationship between teacher change and professional development? Although that it may on the surface look like a good question, the question becomes, well, teacher change, like what teacher change are you interested in? So you might, for example, be interested in teacher incorporation of more inquiry practices in their science education. That would be more specific. And the other question, of course, is what professional development? Maybe you're interested in how lesson study participation supports teacher integration of inquiry practices, right? So narrowing that down, getting a little bit more specific with these kinds of questions. My slides are not forwarding. Okay, they forward. So the next thing I want you to think about is evaluating those different questions. So maybe in the last slide, you brainstormed some more different ways to write questions. Maybe you made your questions more specific, you made them more feasible. Here, I want you to think about a few other things about these research questions. And again, as we go along, I want you to modify your different versions. I still want you to end up with 3 to 4 questions you send me, but I want them to be even more, I want them to all have some specificity. I want them to all be feasible. I want them to all have answered these questions around them. One is, can I define all the concepts or terms in the question so that the meaning is clear and logical? So in this example question, can I define alternative education settings? Right? Can I define this? What does that mean? Can I define project-based learning? Can I define marginalized students? I think the answer is yes to all of those things, and that the meaning is clear. Although, of course, I would want to define that meaning within the introduction and maybe elaborate on it in the literature review. And I specify where I got the concepts from, right? So what body of literature am I drawing on in each of these things? So there's a body of literature for all of this. So there is a place I can go that I can draw from. Sometimes there's not. So you might be thinking about kinds of teaching that, maybe it's something that is, you think about a lot, but there's not a body of literature, and that's okay, but you would need to very carefully define it. The next question is, what would be appropriate evidence for answering this question, right? So what would I need to do to answer this question? At an alternative education setting, in what ways are science teachers incorporating project-based learning into their work with marginalized students? What kinds of data do you think I would need to answer this question? I'm gonna let you think about that for a second. So I'm asking about what teachers are doing. So this implies observations, really. It would be difficult to answer this question without observations. You might also want to do interviews to get teacher thoughts about how they're incorporating it, but I really think it would be hard to answer this question without observations. Maybe a survey could get at it. How much evidence would be necessary to answer it? Well, in a pilot study, you won't be able to collect quite enough evidence to truly answer a question. But it's something to be thinking about for your dissertation. Like, how many observations would I need? Would I need observations and interviews? Those kinds of questions. This question here, to what extent does the question account for something important? That's something for you to, I know you've been thinking about all along, right? You want your research to do something important. And I know that all of you have been doing amazing work out in schools and universities. And your research question is not going to change the world utterly, but it might do a piece of the work. And if you remember from any other paper you read or even alumni you talk to, that it's a narrowed down piece that then contributes to the overall big picture. All right, and finally, of course, we've talked a lot about over time assumptions underlying questions. So what am I assuming in asking this question? I'm assuming that students are marginalized. Certain students are marginalized. So there's a social justice assumption embedded in here. I'm assuming project-based learning is a good thing. So maybe I'm going to have to justify that, right? So those are some of the assumptions in here. We're going to have to wait a moment for my computer to catch up. And let me change the slide here. While you're waiting, do some work on your research questions. Okay, so a couple of examples. These are from some past students. Heather asked, in what ways does the relationship between site administration and special education teachers influence retention of students with disabilities in a charter high school setting? So think about it for a moment. Does this have an appropriate level of specificity? Is it feasible? Might have some issues with feasibility. What kind of research does this imply? Right? It might be action research. It might be qualitative, probably. Here's Zainab's question. Post 9/11, in what ways have Muslim youth resisted the stereotypes prevalent in the media? This has a lot of nice specificity also. There's a timeline specificity, specifying Muslim youth, and actually in her introduction, she specified an exact age level. So there's a lot of specificity here. I think there's a decent amount of feasibility. And think about for a moment what kind of research this would imply. Perhaps interviewing, right, to get the depth of the way that they resisted. So research questions, that just gives you a sense of some ways to workshop your own research questions. So again, you should have had 3 to 4 research questions. Through the process of this video, you should have been workshopping each one to make them more specific, more feasible, more clear, all of the things that we talked about. Those are the research questions I would like for you to share with me in a Google Doc, and then I will weigh in, help advise. I'm now going to turn to a little bit about methods, because you're all in a group, but I just want to share a little bit. I know you've learned quite a lot about this, but just kind of make sure that we're all on the same page. So the categories here, mixed methods, interview, and case study action research, are all the categories that you are in right now that you're learning. And I'm going to talk about the type of data, the participants, and what each of them is good for. So mixed methods, of course, is both quantitative and qualitative. So the quantitative is usually either survey or test data, and the qualitative is usually either interviews or observations. In contrast, interview methods has only one type of data, interviews, which is perfectly fine. And case study and action research can actually have several types of data as well. So it can have surveys, it can have interviews, it can have observations. It could actually be mixed. Case studies and action research occasionally are mixed. But the case is bounded, right? So the difference between case study and mixed methods is mixed methods, you could be surveying, for example, across several districts, et cetera, right? You're not studying a particular case. You're not studying a particular district, a particular school. You might be surveying across multiple people, et cetera. Like, the point is not researching an organization or a case. Whereas in a case study, you're researching a particular organization that's bounded, or a particular person in some cases, or a family or something like that. With action research, similarly, there's a particular set of events, perhaps, or you're working within a particular organization. With mixed methods, the participants, you have one large sample and often a smaller sample. So one large sample for your survey, often a smaller sample for an interviews or observations or a focus group. Often they're from the same group. So you might have a group of people, like a sports team, that you do a focus group with some of them, and then you create a survey that then you give to the entire sports team. So it might be drawn from the same group. An interview, you'll be thinking about your sample in terms of the type of people you want to interview, or maybe it's a spectrum of people you want to interview. So maybe it's Muslim students at a particular university. So you're trying to understand their experiences. And the case study, often you're doing people at different levels of an organization. So you're trying to see, well, what do teachers and administrators and principals all think about one issue? Mixed methods is great for evaluations. It's great for understanding what's going on broadly, as well as getting a few deep experiences. So that's what mixed methods is good for. Interview is excellent for understanding perceptions and experiences. And I think those of you who are in the interview group, that's a lot of what you're trying to understand. And case study and action research are great for evaluations. They're good for studying reforms that you are implementing, and they're great for understanding a system. So I think most of you are in the right group, but in case you have some second thoughts after listening to this, please contact me. All right, just a humor pause here for a moment. We have to make fun of this academic writing thing because, it's important to laugh a little bit. I love this Calvin and Hobbes cartoon. Calvin says, "I used to hate writing assignments, but now I enjoy them. I realize that the purpose of writing is to inflate weak ideas, obscure poor reasoning, and inhibit clarity. With a little practice, writing can be intimidating and an impenetrable fog. Want to see my book report?" And then Hobbes reads, "The dynamic of inner being and monological imperatives in Dick and Jane, a study in psychic transrelational gender modes." And Calvin replies, "Academia, here I come." So just so you know, we try to have a sense of humor about how ridiculous it sometimes can get. And hopefully we actually won't write like that. We'll write a little bit more clearly. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to talking about alignment. Doing a pilot study map is a really important step in trying to understand the whole picture of where you're headed. And the great part is it's a fantastic tool for your dissertation as well. Once I created this tool for this class a couple of years ago, and I actually use it now for every paper I write because it helps me so much to understand, the argument I'm trying to make. That's actually what it's for. It's the argument. And so this is a figure to kind of help you understand the situation, is that you've got your problem, right? You've written a lot about that. You've got your context and you've got your literature and kind of how you want to contribute to the literature. Those all contribute to the research question. So how you're thinking about your research question, and then your methods are based on your research question. All right, so this is kind of one way to think about it. So I'm going to go over the pilot study map example. All right, so this is this is alignment. This is all for alignment. I'm going to scroll down and start with my research question, because we should always start with our research question. And then I'm going to show you how I build up to it. So the research question is, in an urban district, what organizational resources are pivotal to establishing opportunities for science-specific, classroom-focused, inquiry-based professional learning? And then the second question is, in what ways do those resources interact to produce or erode systemic capacity for professional learning? All right. So out of those research questions, what I'm trying to do with the map is, how do I make an argument for the importance of these research questions and where they sit in the literature? All right. So most of this stuff up here is in your introduction, right? So this is all going to end up in your introduction. So you've got your problem of practice, all right? You've done a lot of writing about your problem of practice, but what I'd like for you to think about doing as you revise it is making a funnel argument about the problem of practice, all right? So you start broad and you go narrow. So starting with the broad issue, in my case, in this example, in the era of Common Core and NGSS, those are standard systems, teachers are asked to examine and shift their practices to meet the demands of new standards. So I'm not going to start with like hugely broad. I'm going to start kind of here broad. I'm alerting them that there's something about teachers shifting their practices and that it's important, right? Like I'm making this argument about why it's important in a broad way, that teachers need to shift their practices because there's these new policies. Then I'm getting a little more specific and I'm introducing a new idea. Opportunities for professional learning are a key venue by which teachers will learn and shift their instruction. So I'm introducing that, hey, this paper is about professional learning, and that's how teachers will shift their instruction. So if you see up at the top, I introduce teachers need to shift their instruction. The next point I make is that professional learning is necessary for them to shift their instruction. Now, the next one. However, in science education in high poverty urban districts, these opportunities are often not present or are so haphazard they do not serve the purpose of professional learning. So now I'm introducing the nugget of the problem. I've made an argument for the need. There's new standard systems, teachers need to shift their practice, therefore there's a need for professional learning, but teachers are not getting professional learning in science education, right? I've landed on this issue, all right? Then now I need to introduce one more thing, which is the role of resources, because that's what I'm researching here. Despite the key role districts play in developing and allocating resources to support professional learning, they often fail to provide the necessary structures. Okay, so now I'm introducing the final element of what I'm asking about is what resources are necessary for professional learning. All right, so can you see the causal chain here? Standards necessitate teacher change in practice. Teacher practice necessitates professional learning. There is no professional learning. We need resources to support professional learning. All right, that's my problem of practice. And I would like you to do basically exactly the same thing as you write up your pilot study map and try to like create a funnel argument for your problem of practice. Now, the research problem is a little bit different than the problem of practice, right? All of this issue that I just laid out as the problem of practice may be very well researched. We may know everything there is to know about resources and professional learning, and therefore really it's just a matter of trying to get folks to do it. But you're doing research on something, so you need to make an argument that we need this research, okay? So a lot of times that argument is about the gap in the literature, but that's not necessary. It could just be that we need to know something about this context, right? So maybe you just need to make the argument that in your context, there's a need to understand something, right? Because that's not the point of the dissertation that you are writing, is to make this some major contribution to the literature. But in my case, I was trying to make a contribution to the literature. So I'm again making a bit of a funnel argument. The idea of capacity is often treated quite broadly, with little reference to how districts bring resources to bear on creating professional learning opportunities. So I'm saying, like, there's not a lot that's written about, professional learning opportunities. Then I talk about a specific area of literature that the professional development literature really highlights sheds little light on the subject. It treats the process of supporting or creating opportunities as tangential or as a series of barriers. So I'm saying there's something missing here. Another area that's missing that I talk about is that reform implementation literature provides some insights, but this literature, different elements of capacity are not considered systemically. So I'm kind of saying, well, there's this area of literature and here's the piece that's missing. There's this area of literature, here's a piece that's missing. Mine is sort of in the middle, right? Like it's almost like a Venn diagram. Now, again, your argument may be that equally, like if we think about my problem of practice I just laid out, your argument might be that in San Lorenzo Unified School District, there's a lack of understanding about what resources need to be brought to bear to support professional learning. So that's fine, right? That in our specific context, maybe something is not known, okay? But the point is that your research problem is always a lack of understanding something, whereas the problem of practice is that we're not doing something, all right? So think about those key words as you write up your research problem. Is little is understood, you could use that word. There's little reference to it. We need to understand more about it. Those are the kinds of things you write up in your research problem. All right, now moving into research purpose. And again, all of this is going to end up in your introduction. There's a need. So first, we want to have a need. There's a need to move beyond conceptualizing resources as simple units operating in isolation and towards identifying how sets of resources operate together to support professional learning. All right, and now I'm really getting into kind of my theory and what I'm doing, that I want to understand the constellations of resources that are necessary to support professional learning opportunities. All right, and then, well, how do we do that? We present a qualitative case study of science education reform at a high poverty urban school district. And then the reform goal is focused on moving instruction towards a more student-centered inquiry-based approach. So this is sort of giving a little heads up about our methods and context, right? So I've made my argument about the research problem, then I'm saying the very specific need, and then how does that, what are we doing to address it, okay? Now, we've already talked about the research questions. In the introduction, of course, all of that will then lead into you saying, this is my research question. Now, this is a helpful exercise then to identify what areas of literature you would need to cover in order to support your argument about this, right? So, number one, I know I'm talking about science education. So I'm going to need to talk about the unique context of science education reform and professional learning in science education, right? So the importance of professional learning for instructional reform and probably specific to science education. Then I'm going to have to talk about district use of resources, and particularly district use of resources to support professional learning. You can see a little bit of funnel argument here too, right? So I'm talking about context. I'm talking about importance of professional learning generally, and then for science education, I'm talking about typical use of district resources and then use of resources for professional learning. All right, so what do we know about this? And this one down here is the most key because this is the most closely related to my research question, right? I'm asking in my research question, what resources are necessary for professional learning? And I really need to talk about the empirical research already out there on resources that are used to support professional learning, all right? And then just a brief overview of my methods. I'm doing a case study. So this is my research design case study. This is my data, 26 interviews with teacher leaders, principals, and district administrators. This is my timeline. And then I'm not going to get into the analysis here, but essentially like who I'm collecting data from, how much data, the timeline, and what kinds of data. All right. So that is exactly what I will want to see in your pilot study map. And you can actually copy this example and erase what I've put and put your own sentence there as you develop your pilot study map. And sometimes this is very hard work. I'm just going to warn you. It's like pulling things out of your brain, because this is the organizational work. This is the hardest part. But once you do the organizational work, then writing the pilot study is so much easier. Okay, back to the slideshow here. Just one final point. During the next week or two, you're going to be creating a data collection protocol. A data collection protocol is, it's a series of prompts, like interview prompts. It might be a draft survey. It might be a set of things you might be looking for an observation, but it's essentially the written down thing that will help you go collect the data. All right. So for some of you, it's going to be a set of interview questions, and there's the video to show you how to do that. For others of you, it's going to be creating a draft survey, which is, it's not that easy. It'll take a little bit of time, and the video goes into detail on questions and so forth. Now, you've thought about this a little bit already last semester, and a few of you will need to create an observation protocol, or at least think about what kinds of things you would observe for if you're going to observe. If you need something different, please let me know. So check out the video of the protocol you need to create, and post a comment or a question on that video so I know which one that you checked out and observed. And these things will be, there's a due date, of course, on the syllabus as to when I will need to see these. And again, it's a draft that you will get feedback on both myself and your peers. Okay, that's it for this video. Look for further instructions in an email, like very specific instructions, but enjoy this work as much as you can.